welcome everybody. Happy Thursday to everybody out there. This is our 108th episode of Let's Do Lunch. And since it's Thursday, it is our Rights Tech Forum Day. We have a terrific discussion ahead, which I'll introduce shortly. As we always do, I invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat. It's on the bottom nav. When you make your introductions, make sure to use the drop down and change it to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your intros. It's currently just set at panelists, and you have to change that drop down. And feel free to say a little bit about yourself. And we always get a lot of chatter in the chat during these sessions, and we welcome that. So you're welcome to make, hey, there we go, William Gary, good to see you. If you have questions for the panel, please put them in the Q&A. That is just to the left of the chat, and those will go directly to our speakers today. As I mentioned, it's Rights Tech Day, and who is here to lead us but the fearless Paul Sweeting. Paul, welcome.
Thanks, Ned. I'm actually more fearful than I look. Welcome, everyone. We have what I think is going to be a very interesting conversation for you today on the EU Copyright Directive. But before we get to that, a couple of headlines of note. First of all, for those of you who hadn't already seen the announcement, this will be our final episode of the Rights Tech Roundtable in 2020. We are, Let's Do Lunch will be wrapping up season 1 early next week. So this will be the final Rights Tech Roundtable. We'll be back in 2021, unless things radically change in the world. So I want to take the opportunity to thank all of our previous speakers and to thank the audience that has stuck with us through what has been a very difficult year for everyone. And I hope to see everyone back here next year, which can't come soon enough as far as I'm concerned. The other headline of the week of note, I think for this session anyway, is the UK government on its way out the door of the EU is planning, has announced that it will begin investigating the impact that music streaming is having on artists, record labels, and the sustainability of the music industry. It has formed a new committee that will be under the purview of the Department of Digital, Culture, Media, and Sports. And it will be examining the business models of the major streaming companies, including Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, Google Play, to determine their fairness towards writers and performers, which is a topic I know will be of great interest to to the Rights Tech audience. Those governments that are still within the EU, meanwhile, are preparing to implement the European Union Copyright Directive, formerly known as the Directive on Copyright in the Digital Single Market. They began that process several years ago of developing that that directive, and implementation is they're just getting serious about it ahead of the deadline for implementation, which is in the middle of next year. So that leads us to today's topic, which is in fact the European Union Directive on Copyright in the Digital Single Market. And I'd like to invite our guest speaker today, Mike Edwards of Audible Magic. There we go. There's Mike.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Mike, in your lovely virtual background there.
Yes.
When was that picture taken, by the way? Because it's
I guess it
clearly
was
autumn.
Yeah, it must have been a year or two ago. It certainly wasn't now. It's not as good weather right now.
Oh, well, it is England, where you are, right? Mike is based outside of London in Wimbledon. Do you play tennis?
I did, but my knee gave in.
Ah,
So I'm awaiting a knee replacement, and as soon as that comes through, I'll go and play tennis again.
okay. So Mike Edwards is the Vice President of Music Licensing and European Operations for Audible Magic. He, before coming to Audible Magic, he had his own consulting business, Michael Edwards and Associates, and he has a history in the music industry. He's been kicking around for a while, working in licensing, copyright, anti-piracy issues, and so forth. He has also held executive positions at the IFPI Secretariat, Timbuktu Records, Sony Music International, and he holds a master's degree in law, specializing in intellectual property from the London School of Economics. Very impressive. So welcome, Mike. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Paul.
So before we get too deep into the topic, what can you, for the few folks in the audience who may not be familiar with Audible Magic, can you tell us a little bit about who Audible Magic is and what it does?
Yeah, Audible Magic is a Silicon Valley company. It's a tech company started in 1999, so it is quite an old company by tech standards, and it is focused around content recognition technology. Our core scientists published many of the earliest scientific papers on content recognition, got many of the early patents in this area, and have been keeping at the cutting edge of content recognition and its applications over the last 20 years. 21 years now.
Okay. So the Copyright Directive was formally adopted last year, correct? In 2019.
That's correct. Yeah, June 2019.
June 2019. And the formal deadline by which member states are required to implement the directive in their local copyright law is June of 2021, correct?
That's correct.
Right. And so far, France and to a lesser extent the Netherlands are the only countries that I'm aware of that have made much progress in that direction. Is that correct?
Well, it's not fully correct. And I would say France and the Netherlands have made the most progress, but and everyone suffered a bit of hiatus in March of this year when parliaments went into recess with COVID. And the French had already published a draft law by that time. And what the French Assembly did to make up for lost time is they actually gave the government the power to implement the directive, or transpose, as they call it in European jargon, the directive by decree. The Italian legislative have done the same, so we would expect Italy and France to issue those decrees in the very near future. The Netherlands has published a bill. It's going through their legislature right now. It's had hearings just very recently. So those are definitely the front runners. But from what I'm told, pretty much every member state, with a few notable exceptions, have either published discussion documents or published draft laws. And I'm told that with with again, with probably 2 exceptions, all of them are on schedule to finish by June, beginning of June next year.
So the directive as adopted is a pretty huge set of ideas and mandates and so forth. You know, you could spend another year trying to get your head around all of its various components. But I think for the RightsTech audience, the component of it that is probably of most interest and potentially have the most impact is what has come to be known as Article 17. It used to be Article 13, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
There was some readjustment of within the ordering of things within the directive, and it's now Article 17. And we could spend a year trying to parse out the various nuances of Article 17, but can we summarize sort of at a 30,000 foot level? I don't know what that would be in meters. I guess we should be probably talking meters. You know, what Article 17 says, what it, you know, intends to do.
Okay, its aim really was to encourage licensing and creation of user-generated content. And I mean, it had its genesis in a campaign, I think, initiated by the music industry anyway, by copyright owners, for which where they wanted to, as they called it, redress the balance and close what they called the value gap, where platforms were claiming safe harbor and therefore they couldn't negotiate license agreements on an even playing field. So what the directive does, and in its own words, it clarifies existing European law, though that may be a bit of an exaggeration, but it clarifies the law that platforms can, in some circumstances, be direct infringers of copyright for content that has been uploaded by their users. And in the US, the position is that there's a safe harbor. In the UK, or sorry, in Europe, we weren't sure. But there's a stream of recent cases going in that direction. Directive says codifies that. Clearly, now platforms can be directly responsible for making available the content to the public. And they define what sort of platforms. It's platforms that store and give access to a large amount of copyright content, and it's platforms that organize and promote the content for profit-making purposes.
So Google, basically, YouTube.
It could be YouTube, it could be, I mean, it covers a multitude of platforms. It then also lists a lot of types of platforms that don't fall within it, such as, and they don't name the platforms, but it's aimed at things like eBay, online storage services, GitHub, places like that, Wikipedia. So those types of platforms are specifically outside the other thing that's really interesting is it applies outside the EU. So as long as a platform is accessible from within the EU, it is covered by the law to the extent that it's accessible there. So, yeah.
So does it, what does it stipulate platforms must do to avoid becoming a direct infringer?
Yeah, so it says they can be liable, therefore they must get licenses. But then it introduces a very specific safe harbor where one arguably didn't exist before. And so what it says in Article 17 is if a platform uses their best efforts to get licenses, and they use their best efforts according to high industry standards of due diligence to prevent the availability on their platform of unauthorized content, then they have no liability.
So what does that mean in practical terms?
That's the big question that everyone is asking and no one has a clear answer to. And there are a number of answers, and you have to remember this applies to all types of copyright content. So it's not just music or film or TV. And copyright is a weird thing. It's not like a patent or a trademark where you can go to a register and search it and find what is protected. Right. Copyright, as soon as you record your creation in a material form, it's copyright. And no one else will have any idea that it exists until you actually tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, that's mine, you're using it.
Right.
And so they've said, okay, the rights holders have to give the platforms the relevant and necessary information to enable them to identify content. And only then do they have a duty to protect that and prevent it from being distributed. So platforms have to do whatever conforms with the high standard. And the law actually recognizes that for different types of copyright, there'll be different standards. And for some where there's no system that exists to recognize particular content, the best efforts may just be to react to a notice from the copyright owner to take it down.
So is it fair to say that rights owners everywhere in Europe and as well as in the US have been seeking stricter limits on safe harbors on UGC platforms for, since there were UGC platforms, or at least since safe harbors were enshrined in copyright law, beginning with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act here in the US. So is it, this is something they have been pushing for, lobbying for, litigating for a long time. Is it fair to say that the sort of broad understanding of Article 17 is that this was basically a win for rights owners, that they will now have the sort of legal backing to provide them the leverage they need to negotiate better terms, as it were, from the
in that respect, definitely it's a win for the right holders. But I also think that the definition of it, this clear definition of a safe harbor and a reasonably clear definition of what the platform has to do, actually works to the benefit of platforms as well. So I think in a very roundabout way, the Commission has achieved its objective of creating an environment that's going to stimulate licensing, rather than the situation which has existed up till then of platforms blocking whenever they found copyright content and taking content down.
So will this do away with the basic long-standing notice and takedown process?
No, not at all. I think the system, the law actually recognizes that in some forms of copyright there isn't a way for platforms to identify what is copyright and what isn't. And in those cases, there will be notice and takedown. So definitely there will still be notice and takedown. But there will be a big incentive for platforms to try and make sure, well, first of all, to get licenses, and then to try and make sure that they recognize content that isn't licensed and prevent it from being uploaded. They also need to recognize content that is licensed so they can allocate the revenues to the creators, to the correct creators.
Right. Now, recently, there was some guidance published by the European Commission on implementation what are they, transposing, I think they call
yes.
Transposing Article 17 into law. And it was somewhat controversial in that at least some folks on the rights owner side saw it as kind of rewriting Article 17 after the fact, and perhaps not imposing the requirements on platforms that they thought they had achieved, that the rights owners thought they had achieved.
Quite right. Yeah, that came as a result of what they called the stakeholder dialogue. And the commission was required to convene a dialogue of interested stakeholders. And I'll just read what it was. It was to establish best practices with regard to the appropriate industry standards of due diligence, and to ensure the uniform application of the obligation of cooperation between the platforms and the right holders. That process got interrupted by the COVID crisis. So they didn't finish the full dialogue, which in a way was a blessing because it wasn't a dialogue. It basically ended up as a continuation of the lobbying competition. And so the commission has now, they haven't actually they haven't put out the guidelines yet. They've put out
it was
a draft for consultation. Yeah. Right. And as you say, it was pretty controversial, as everything has been through this process. And I spoke to a legislator, a member of the European Parliament during the process. They'd been a member of the Parliament for 20 years, and they said never had they ever come across a piece of legislation that was as controversial as this one. So
that's quite a statement.
Yeah, yes. And there's been some pretty controversial laws go through that Parliament.
Quite a few.
So yeah, pretty much everyone has objected to the draft guidelines at some point of the draft guidelines, which is in keeping with the tradition of the directive as a whole.
So is that going to slow down the implementation process that is already underway in countries?
Well, I think the member states can be divided into two groups. One are the groups led by France and Holland, which have just gone ahead and drafted laws. There's another group that is waiting for the guidelines, and I suppose that it will slow things down. Yeah, as always happens with this directive, you can't really predict what's going to happen next. And yeah, I think the Commission tried very hard to cater to please everyone and produce something that had something in it for everyone. And what they succeeded in doing was produce something that had in it that really irritated the hell out of everyone.
It's the old camel being a horse designed by a committee.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Audible Magic is a company that helps people identify content.
Yeah.
So what have your conversations been like with people on both sides of both rights owners and platform providers?
Well, we've been in the lucky position of being the neutral third party in the middle of it all. I mean, sometimes it's lucky and sometimes we get shouted at by both sides. But by and large, I think we've had very positive dialogues with both the platforms and the rights owners. We are able to, and we've been working for some years, even before the directive even was, well, before we'd even heard that it was going to happen, on putting together a process for licensing content. And for many years, we've been responsible for identifying the content that gets blocked. And we said, well, we went to the rights owners and said, are you sure you want all this content blocked? Why don't we get it up there and monetize it for you? And they said, that sounds like a great idea. Speak to our business affairs guys and get licenses done. And here, just 3.5 years later, we almost have got all the licenses done. So we're providing the means to recognize the content. We're also aggregating a lot of licenses so platforms can get licenses from us in one stop rather than going across the many, many thousands of copyright owners all around
Yeah,
the
I
world.
mean, that's one of the things that's puzzled me about, you know, it's one thing to identify copyrighted content, but as you said earlier, you know, as soon as something is fixed in a tangible medium, at least as the U.S. law phrases it, it's essentially born copyrighted.
Yeah.
How is any platform, no matter how large and with how many resources, expected to secure licenses with a potentially unlimited number of rights owners?
Well, I mean, the music and probably film and TV industries are in much better position. There are centralized databases which have global data in them. We have one of them, but there are others. But there isn't a centralized database for pictures or graphic arts or journalistic output. So, and there's no central place you can get licenses for those. So it's a difficult task there. But then again, where there aren't the clear avenues, what is the only thing that's required of the platforms is to take down when they get a notice from the copyright owner.
So let's drill down on that a little bit. So if it, from a practical perspective, is not possible to secure licenses after making best efforts.
Yes, they have to make best efforts first.
Now, does the directive define best efforts?
No, that's one of the other riddles. What is best efforts? And if there's a central body that has global licenses for the world for all a particular type of copyright, that would be very easy, but there isn't. And so, I mean, the platforms have to try and make best efforts. There's various industry bodies representing the various types of copyright owners. And I would guess it would all depend on a case-by-case basis where the platforms have made the approaches that.
And how does the directive anticipate that being adjudicated? Does it create some body to determine whether you have made best efforts?
No.
Or is that the courts of the individual countries after litigation? How is that supposed to work?
Well, the law hoped that the stakeholder dialogue would produce harmony amongst all parties and agreement on what best efforts would be, but that didn't happen at all. So yeah, it's very difficult. Again, in music and in film and TV, there are bodies that are set up to license. They are pretty spread out all over the world, and copyright is national, whereas the internet is global. So it is a massive task. So what we're doing is very much simplifying that task. And the other thing that we recognize is that platforms are tech organizations. The last thing they think about is copyrights and how to administer copyrights. And the last thing they are going to spend development bucks on is administration systems. They want to spend their money on making sure they have the coolest site and keep the attention of their users for the longest. So we're doing the boring bit and providing that to them.
Just a reminder to folks, if you do have questions for Mike, please put them in the Q&A queue. And I'll, in a little bit, we'll be putting up an audience poll to find out try to find out how closely people have actually been following these developments. But before we get to that, I wanted to go back, Mike, to, so Audible Magic is actually going to rights owners or rights owners organizations, figuring out what licenses would look like.
Yeah.
And then making those available on their behalf to platforms.
Yeah, this is, we're still in the process of aggregating licenses, but by the time the directive comes into force, we'll have a critical mass of licenses, at least in the
Can you
United
tick
States and
off a
Europe.
few, is that, so from the music industry, film and television?
We're focusing right now just on music.
Just on music.
We picked the easy one.
Yeah. So are you thinking that down the line you'll get to the other media sectors, or do you?
I would like to think that we could do that once we set up the systems and really cut our teeth on and I think music licensing is incredibly complicated, but as soon as I get onto film and TV, I'll find everything is complicated.
Yeah, but it's not an opinion; it's a fact that music and licensing is extremely complicated. I mean, it's
Yeah.
And as most of the folks who are watching this show probably understand. How are, so you've been working with the rights owners to aggregate these licenses. I assume you've also been in dialogue with platforms.
Yeah.
And as you said, they're, by and large tech companies with the orientation of not thinking very much about copyright as their in their their day-to-day operation of their business. So how are those conversations going?
And again, they're going well. I mean, we've had a lot of very comprehensive discussions with across the board in several of the companies. Our customers include the biggest social media networks in the world, but also include some very tiny ones. And so we've had discussions with all of those.
And are there differences between what the biggest companies, the biggest platforms have to do and the tiny ones have to do?
Yeah, there's some very specific differences. I mean, there is an exception on the requirement to prevent unauthorized content on their platform for brand new companies, and they've defined them as companies that are less than 3 years old, had less than 10 million euros revenue in the previous year, and have less than 5 million monthly users. So those guys are specifically exempt from the requirement to do the prevention. The rest of the law still does apply to them. But then there's also something.
But they're not permanently exempt, correct? Should they
As
grow?
As soon as they achieve any one of the, or as soon as they surpass any one of those limitations, they then they fall into the main body of the law. But then there's also something in Europe called the principle of proportionality. And
yes.
And that again is one of these nice European vague concepts that everyone understands what it means until you ask them to explain it. And so it would mean that there'd be a higher requirement on bigger platforms.
For bigger companies than
yeah.
Smaller companies. Is there a fear that would act as a disincentive to grow for a platform? Or
I don't think that there's going to be that something as small as getting your licensing organized is going to be a barrier to growth. And remember, we've been in this business for 20 years. We've been dealing with social media platforms for over 12 years. And our customers were tiny when they started working for us. Some of them, many of them were smaller than we were. YouTube was smaller than us when they were our first customer. It hasn't been a barrier to growth at all.
Okay. I'm going to put up our poll here. Get a sense of how closely folks have been following all of this. You can't answer the poll. You and I can't answer the poll, but anyone else is welcome to weigh in. and we'll be publishing the results of those once the votes are in. We do have a number of questions that folks have posted. Perhaps we should take a look at some of them. An anonymous attendee asks, how are platforms expected to build these new solutions themselves to identify copyright and pay for them? We've sort of been talking about that. We've sort of covered it, but is there anything else you think?
I'd say for film and TV and music and sound recordings of any kind, Audible Magic provides that service. There isn't a centralized service for other systems, but the law doesn't require them to. If there isn't a service, all they need to do is react promptly to takedown notices.
Nick Blake, how you doing, Nick? If your AI compared Robin Thicke's Blurred Lines with Marvin Gaye's Gotta Give It Up, would it find a copyright violation?
I would say we would definitely not find, we don't find copyright violations. We say,
you identify.
Does this unknown piece of sound match something in our reference database? Exactly. Is it the same thing? The Blurred Lines case was two different things that it was argued one copied the other. But no, definitely we would not identify that.
William Gary wants to know how Audible Magic is different from PEX. Basically, PEX is another company that provides a service in identifying content and attributing it to the appropriate parties, and has also been working very diligently getting ready for implementation of the copyright directive. Are you different from PEX in regards to being an aggregator for licensing for platforms? And the answer is no. You are aggregating licenses for platforms.
Yeah, we do.
And I assume there are other, PEX is based in the U.S. You're based in the U.S. I assume there are, indigenous European tech developers who are.
Yes, there are. There are definitely content recognition technologies in Europe, and several companies provide those services. Generally, they're focused. The market isn't that big or that lucrative for people. So most of the content recognition technologies are focused on particular types of application. Like there was Shazam,
right,
based on mobile applications. There's some focus on broadcast monitoring, some focus on producing cue sheets for movie soundtracks, film and TV soundtracks. So there's a lot of technology out there. They generally tend to find their niche and focus on that. Although I think with Article 17, we'll see more and more technologies using the application more generally.
Yeah, we haven't discussed it here really, but there's another controversial article in the directive now known as, I think, Article 15. It used to be Article 11, that covers basically news content and the requirement that platforms secure licenses to from news publishers, newspapers, magazines. Well, when there were magazines, digital media, for the appearance of even relatively small snippets on their of content on their platform. There is there technology available that could
Well, with
assist in identifying. I mean, I know it's not Audible Magic's business, but are you aware of technologies that might be deployed to assist in that process?
Well, I think it's not so much a question of is there technology, but is there an organization that's gone to the trouble of accumulating a database and getting this a big global reference database? And as far as I know, that doesn't exist.
No, I don't think that exists. Anonymous back, I don't know if it's the same Anonymous or a different Anonymous. How does an individual content creator obtain a license now? Today, I would just be turned down by a platform.
So how do they give a license? That's, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, it depends what they actually create. If they are music, there's many services that aggregate music from individual creators. So that would be one avenue. And those negotiate either individually or through bodies like Merlin, which represent independent producers. But I'm not sure that's to what extent there's licensing bodies for other types of content.
We have a lot of anonymous folks, or else one very active anonymous fellow out there or person out there asking, can you talk about streaming in the directive? Does streaming fall under Article 17?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We actually asked, and there's an article being published in the European Intellectual Property Review in the forthcoming issue that deals with this subject. And the conclusion in that article is that streaming does fall under the directive, and so services that provide streaming services, even though the streams originate from a user, could be liable under the directive. So it's not absolutely clear, but this article by a leading academic in Europe says that it is.
So is that your nighttime reading, the European Union Intellectual Property Review or whatever it was?
Well, that's something that crosses my desk occasionally. Yeah.
These days we all have more reading time than we used to. Because Emmanuel Legrand, how are you, Emmanuel? Good to see you here. Hi, Mike. What will happen to the UK? Will it stay outside of the directive framework? And I think the UK government has said it will not be implementing that.
Yeah, that's a good question, Emmanuel. Great to see you as well. Yeah, the UK has said it won't, but it also has a very strong creator lobby. So it may, in its own time, enact its own law.
Is anything moving on that front within the UK?
No. I think the UK's got enough on its plate right now.
Yeah, probably. Alan Schwartz asks, with so many online concerts happening now, are you starting to work on content recognition with respect to live concerts?
Well, our core technology recognizes an existing sound recording. Of course, live concerts, unless they just playing to dubs, is not previously recorded. But yes, we do have technology that will recognize what we call covers, and so we will be
right. But I mean, you can't have a reference library for a live performance, correct?
Yeah.
I mean, so
yeah, there is melody ID technologies. There are melody ID technologies out there that are not as accurate as recognizing a sound recording, but reasonably accurate. And we have developed a pretty good technology that does that. We're about to go into a beta test with a major copyright owner representing songwriters. So yeah, it's possible, and I would imagine it'll be out there in the marketplace in the coming year.
You know, it obviously live streaming of music performances has become quite a phenomenon, and there are a lot of efforts underway to figure out monetization models for it. So I expect that some type of recognition technology is going to be required to have an effective, comprehensive monetization strategy.
Yeah, I think with monetization of any type of user-generated content, recognition of what it is that's being monetized and correct attribution to the creators is absolutely important.
So I think I'm gonna, we're coming up on the end here. I think I'm gonna end the polling and share the results. We asked how closely people have been following all of this, and it's kind of split between not very closely and very closely, which is a little bit unexpected. We asked if people or organizations out there have you know, expect to benefit or expect to be harmed by implementation of the directive. And let's see, we must have a fair number of rights owners out there, or rights owner organizations out there, because almost 70% say they expect some more significant benefit.
Oh, I think there may be some platforms in there as well.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Fair point. Small number believe they might be harmed by it. And you know, about a fifth say they don't know what the hell the copyright directive is. So there's still some education to be done out there. And have you taken you or your organization taken any steps, significant steps to prepare? And this is impressive, actually. 42% say they've taken steps or made significant preparations to take steps. And you know, that's an even larger percentage if you eliminate the folks who don't expect to be affected by it. So so people are, at least the people who turn into the Rights Tech Roundtable, are following this and taking it seriously. And I guess that's good news for Audible Magic.
Well, I hope so. And well, I hope it's good news for creators, and I hope it's good news for platforms.
We're just about out of time. We have one other question that's come in. Would apps that detect copyrighted media be liable under this law, like Shazam or SoundHound, given that you can stream a clip of a song after the app ID'd it? I'm not sure I understand that.
Yeah, I wasn't sure of that one either.
So that was also an anonymous attendee. You know, if you want to try to clarify the question and email me, Paul at concurrentmedia.com, I can try to run it by Mike then and try to get an answer back to you. But we're just about out of time. And so I again wanted to thank Mike, of course, and all of the other speakers that have helped us out in this first season of the Roundtable. And Ned, who do we have up tomorrow for the Business of Music?
Well, first off, Paul and Mike, really appreciate your time today in tackling a complex topic and answering so many great questions as well. Yeah, as Paul said, we are gearing up to end the first season, where today was our 108th episode, as I mentioned. So we've been really doing a lot of shows this year, and we've been building a great audience. We really appreciate everyone who comes out to these shows. Our next show is actually on Monday, and it will wrap a series of 3 shows that we've done on the business of streaming, on the psychology of the subscriber. And Colin Dixon will be back, and we'll have the team from Singular Decisions who will be on to talk about churn specifically. So join us on Monday for that show. And then we are now in the process of planning for the Future of Television conference. And there have been some notices about that. There may be some folks in this community interested. That show, it will be a 3-day virtual conference, November 10th, 11th, and 12th. And we're also starting to talk about what we're doing for 2021. So those of you in the Rights Tech community who are interested in these shows going into 2021, as well as our plans for a Rights Tech track at Digital Entertainment World, which we produce in February, reach out to Paul or reach out to me. We look forward to chatting with folks. All right, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you back here on Monday.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Ned.
Yep.